Los Angeles, California, United States. A private training loft above a shuttered storefront near Sunset Boulevard. November 22, 1969, Saturday, 8:41 p.m. The room was already crowded when the last of the invited guests arrived. Not crowded in a public way. There were no tickets, no ushers, no posted notices, but crowded with bodies that knew how to stand close without brushing shoulders. Coats were folded and stacked on a piano bench that hadn't been tuned in years. Someone had turned off the street-facing lights, leaving only the interior fixtures on, as if to signal to the outside that nothing was happening here tonight. People spoke quietly, then stopped. Conversations thinned into murmurs. The sense in the room was not excitement so much as caution, the shared understanding that this gathering was not meant to leave the walls. There had been talk for weeks, not announcements, just fragments, a sentence overheard at a studio lot, a comment passed between trainers after hours. Someone had said there would be a demonstration. Someone else said it was a challenge. No one could agree on the wording. The only thing that traveled intact was the feeling that it should not be happening, that it would be better for everyone if it didn't, and that this very reluctance was why people kept showing up. Witnesses later said the air felt dense, not with heat, but with restraint. This was a mixed crowd. Strength athletes, martial arts instructors, a few film people who had learned to keep quiet when told. There were no cameras. That rule had been set early and repeated often. The man who locked the door did it without ceremony, as if he had done it before. When the lock clicked, no one objected. She arrived without entourage. Those who recognized her did so immediately, not because she was loud or theatrical, but because her presence carried a certain finality. She was built for leverage, thick through the shoulders, forearms corded and dense, hands broad with the blunt confidence of someone who had won contests where there were no second chances. Witnesses disagreed on her exact measurements, but most placed her just under 6 feet. Heavier than she looked, balanced and grounded. She was known in arm wrestling circles as a world champion, a title that at the time meant something different than it would later. There were no televised brackets, no sponsor banners. Reputation traveled hand to hand, match to match. People respected her because she ended things cleanly. Those who had faced her spoke about pressure that arrived early and never eased. They said the table told the story before the arm did. When she took a seat, the room adjusted around her without instruction. Chairs shifted, sight lines cleared, the center of gravity moved. Bruce Lee was already there. Those who noticed him late said that was the point. Bruce Lee did not enter like an announcement. He stood near the edge at first, slight compared to the champion across the room, his frame compact, coiled rather than broad. He was shorter, lighter by any estimate, and dressed without markers, no belt colors, no insignia. Some people knew him from film sets, others from private training sessions, others only from stories told by people they trusted. The whispers around his name were careful. Fast hands, unusual strength for his size, a way of paying attention that unsettled opponents before contact. He looked like someone visiting a closed world, aware of the rules without needing them explained. The contrast was immediate and uncomfortable. On one side, an authority figure whose discipline was visible in the shape of her arms and the way she claimed space. On the other, Bruce Lee, whose authority, if it could be called that, seemed to rest in stillness. Witnesses recalled that he watched more than he spoke, eyes moving between hands, elbows, the edge of the table that had been dragged into the center earlier that evening. The table itself was solid oak, scarred from years of use, its legs braced with metal brackets that suggested someone had anticipated stress. The origin of the challenge was never recorded, only retold. Some said it began at a small party weeks earlier, the kind of gathering where conversations overlap and half of what's said is lost. Someone mentioned arm wrestling as a measure of real strength. Someone else laughed. The champion, present but not performing, had reportedly said something about leverage and discipline, about how technique mattered more than spectacle. A third party, later embarrassed by their role, repeated the comment elsewhere and added a name, Bruce Lee. The sentence traveled as it returned. By the time it returned, it sounded like an invitation. Bruce Lee's response, as told by those who asked him directly, was brief. He did not argue definitions. He did not defend his size. He listened, nodded once, and said very little. One witness remembered him asking only about conditions, how many people, where, what rules. It was described as a decision made without performance, the kind that happens quietly when someone has already measured the cost. The terms were set with care. This would be private, attendance limited to those already in the room and a few more who arrived before the door was locked. No cameras, no recordings, no notes taken during the event. The contest would be straightforward, arm wrestling at a standard table, elbows down, hands clasped, no theatrics. There would be one exchange, not a series, no warm-up matches. The stakes were implied rather than stated. In a room like this, reputation did not need to be announced.
As people settled, the lighting drew attention without drama. The central fixture above the table cast a clean pool of light, leaving the edges of the room in shadow. Faces were visible but softened, details lost as if to discourage later certainty. Trainers leaned forward. Film people folded their arms and watched, the way they watched takes that might not be usable. There was no cheering, no calls for silence. The silence arrived on its own. The champion took her seat first. She placed her elbow, tested the surface, adjusted her grip on the table edge with her free hand. There was a confidence in her movements that did not ask permission. Witnesses said she smiled once, not at Bruce Lee, but at the familiarity of the setup. This was her environment, translated into a smaller room. Bruce Lee approached without haste. He rolled his shoulders once, not as a show, more as a check. When he placed his elbow, it was precise, close to his body, forearm vertical. He adjusted the height of his chair by an inch, then stopped. He did not look at the crowd. His attention narrowed to the contact point. The contrast sharpened. The champion's forearm filled the space between shoulder and wrist, veins visible under the skin. Bruce Lee's arm looked spare by comparison, muscle arranged differently, compact and defined without excess. Some in the room felt a tightening in the chest, the sense that they were watching something that would not resolve in a way the room could easily explain. There was a brief discussion of grip, not argumentative, just practical. Hands met. The contact was described later as neutral, neither dominant nor yielding. The referee, an older trainer known to both parties, looked at each elbow, nodded once, and stepped back. The silence before the start was longer than expected, not long in minutes, but long enough for people to notice their own breathing. In that pause, witnesses said, it became clear that whatever would happen quickly, and that speed was not the same as excitement. At the signal, there was no surge, no dramatic lean, instead a subtle shift. Bruce Lee's shoulder rotated inward by a fraction, his wrist aligning in a way that redistributed force. Those close enough to see said the change was visible only if you were looking for it. The champion applied pressure as she always did, confident in a method that had ended countless matches. The table did not move at first. Then the sound arrived. It was not a crash, it was a sharp wooden report, the kind that comes from stress finding a weak point. One of the table's legs splintered near the bracket. The surface tilted a few degrees, enough to break alignment. The match ended not with a pin, but with the sudden loss of structure. Hands separated reflexively as the table dipped, chairs scraping as people stood to keep it from collapsing fully. In the moment that followed, no one spoke. The champion remained seated, her arms still raised where resistance had been. Bruce Lee stepped back, releasing his grip immediately, his hands open. The broken leg hung at an angle, the bracket bent. The outcome was clear, without being declared. Witnesses later argued about what exactly had happened in that brief exchange. Some said the table had been compromised already. Others insisted it had held heavier loads before. A few focused on Bruce Lee's wrist position, on the way force had been redirected rather than opposed. What most agreed on was the absence of celebration. Bruce Lee did not smile. He did not explain. He looked at the table once, then at the champion, and inclined his head slightly.
The psychological shift in the room was more pronounced than any physical movement. The champion's confidence, which had filled the space moments earlier, did not collapse in anger or denial. It receded. Witnesses described it as a withdrawal, a reassessment that happened internally. She stood, flexed her fingers, and examined the broken leg without accusation. When she spoke, her voice was even. She said something about equipment. It was not an excuse so much as a way to place the event somewhere manageable. The crowd reacted unevenly. Some leaned into belief, nodding as if a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Others resisted, pointing to variables, to the absence of a clean pin. Arguments formed in low tones, careful not to escalate. A few people laughed, not from amusement, but from release. The tension had nowhere else to go. Bruce Lee gathered his things without drawing attention. He did not linger to answer questions. Those who tried to catch his eye found him already moving toward the edge of the room. When the door was unlocked and opened, street noise filtered in briefly, a reminder of the world that had continued without this interruption. He stepped out, and the door closed behind him. In the days that followed, the story fractured. In some retellings, the table breaking became the central image, proof of something extraordinary. In others, it was dismissed as a coincidence, a failure of furniture elevated by rumor. The champion continued to compete and win, her reputation intact, though those who knew her well said she became more selective about conditions. Bruce Lee did not reference the event publicly. When asked, he redirected the conversation or let it end. Years later, when the names had accumulated more meaning and the industry had changed, the story resurfaced in fragments. A trainer would mention it after hours. A film worker would recall being there, then stop short of conclusions. Public audiences, encountering the tale without context, tended toward disbelief. Arm wrestling champions were supposed to look a certain way. Tables were supposed to hold. Private events without footage were easy to doubt. But in quiet rooms, among people who had learned to listen for what wasn't said, the story persisted with restraint, not as a victory to be celebrated, but as a moment that clarified something about control, about how force could be applied without spectacle. Those who told it often ended the same way, not with a moral, but with an image, a broken table leg, a slight bow, a door closing softly on a street that did not know what it had missed. The room above the storefront was repurposed within a year. The table was repaired, then replaced. The people moved on to other contests, other stories. Yet the event lingered in the way certain stories do, resistant to embellishment, because the facts, sparse as they were, carried enough weight. It remained a private truth, passed carefully, surviving not because it sounded impressive, but because it sounded inconvenient.